Hello and welcome to the next episode. This time we are going to look at the Nobility estate, which is the so-called second estate in your realm. And we are going to check out, of course, again, everything we can do here. In comparison to the clergy, which we left off in the last episode, the Nobility has a lot more stuff here, a lot more buttons, or rather no, not more buttons, but more icons here. Because the Nobility, in comparison to the other factions, estates, has privileges. These down here are privileges of the Nobility, which you need to consider whenever you do something. And they also have reforms similar to the clergy. The Nobility is, of course, much more influential in your realm than the clergy is right now. We have 75% power on them. Basically, if we check our provinces here, we can see that they are everywhere where we check. 75.44, going up, down a little bit. Here it's 70%. And in Naples, our capital, let's click on it. Come on, there we go. It is 70%, going down slowly. The Nobility plays a role everywhere at start. It is responsible for basically collecting your taxes. It is taxing your peasantry on its own, because it's very feudalistic currently. It also provides you with levied armies, so you have to raise levies from your nobility. But it also will not really pay taxes. The good thing is that they pay for the military themselves, so you don't really have to pay for the military they give you, but still. And they also are having these privileges which will give them stuff which instead is not going to either the population or you as a state. For example, let's pick a very nice example here. The court system. So for example, the national courts in your realm are very dominated by the nobility, which is basically favoring them whenever something happens. So if there is an incident where, for example, a nobleman mistreats a peasant, the courts will basically always rule in favor for the nobility here. The same goes for example, the autonomous holdings here. So the nobilities have a lot of power on the countryside because they are more or less left on their own there, and the state doesn't interact there. Which means on the other hand that we have less bureaucratic costs to pay as a state, but it will also shrink our tax income because we don't know what the nobles are doing in their realm, on their farms and on their estates. There are other things, for example, here, like what do they owe us? The obligations here are relatively low, which we can reform and get rid of, but they also, the commitment to the paying noble levies to the state are also very low. So we get only like 40% of the levies we could get from the nobility here, because we have the low obligations law for services. But it's also, for example, that the diplomacy is dominated by the nobility, which costs us a diplomat, but we get in return some kind of reputation because the noblemen are more respected as diplomats. We also have reforms here, which is similar to the privileges here, which we can reform into, up and down. I'm going to just focus on these governance here. So basically our nobility is currently called nobility. If we were to reform them into the next level, which is basically aristocracy, so we make them weaker, we can see a lot of impacts here. In short, they will be able to subtract less value from your peasantry, they will become less powerful, and the state can instead have more impact, or rather the lower classes can accrue more wealth here, which is currently completely absorbed by the other estates, so making your peasants richer when the nobility gets weaker. Another one I want to show here is the military organization. We are currently fully feudal by having levied armies, but if we check here in the rights and reforms, similar to when we did that with the clergy, we can see here the military organization has a lot of levels. We will be able to move from a levied armies towards a career soldiery, for example, which will lead to bureaucratic conscription, or rather debuff the nobility, make them weaker because they no longer play a role in the military. Of course, career soldiery is not the last step, because the more meritocratic you go, so a merit-based recruitment will weaken the nobility further, but also improve your military further. We also have these reforms over here in the bureaucracy, which we could also check out in this instance here. Military service, because we also have to develop our state to cover these kind of recruitments. For example, we have to get from devolve, which goes hand in hand with levied armies, into volunteer systems, into enlistment systems, and then later on a general conscription in the very, very late game. And these things you have to do when you hit the conditions for it. For example, right now we would need a military idea group which we need to finish, which is something we do over time. So the next idea group would be unlocked at Adventech 18, which is 3 technologies array currently. And therefore, over time, you can do more reforms in your realm and therefore modernize your army and modernize your taxation, basically. And of course, you also have the same stuff like in the clergy. You can assess their power, where you can see how rich they are, how much shareholding in your land and property they have. And also you can interact them by supporting them, which will lead to you trading mostly debuffs for loyalty. Or you get, for example, a consort from them if you don't have a wife as a king yet, which will empower them but gives them also loyalty. But you could also promote them to just make them more influential, which will of course annoy the other faction because you have a preference towards the nobility. But you could also do things like leveraging them, which means that you could take away their land, so take property. You can demote them so they lose power. You could protect the peasantry, which will make them more free and therefore weaken the nobility indirectly. But you could, for example, also leverage the nobility for more relations and diplomatic reputation if you basically put them into more influential positions, more or less. Overall, managing the nobility for most of the realms here in Europe is the key part of what you want to do. So it's a steady decision making between, can I afford to annoy the nobility without losing too much military and economic potential to reform my state, or reform one of the other factions, so that your realm stays stable, governed by the nobility and the bureaucracy, by, for example, getting rid of the clergy. You always have to handle these kind of estates, and the nobility is the most powerful one, therefore the most important one to handle. If you start the game for the first time, I always recommend to start with, for example, yielding concessions here, which will sacrifice some prestige and centralization for loyalty, which is a very cheap interaction. And what you also can do is promote them, which will give them more influence in the faction system, but they are already the dominant faction anyway, so this will be fine as well. And so you get the loyalty up, which will make them like you more and pay you more money and give you more manpower from their levies, therefore opening up some military options here. And that's the nobility, something you will enjoy and suffer from for most of the time for the next 300 years, until you probably have bureaucratized enough to really break their neck and break their backbone, basically, and you get them into a governance level where they really lose everything very quickly. So, for example, we are currently in the nobility. Some states start on signori. I'm not sure how to pronounce this one, which is even worse. But basically, you want to work towards aristocracy relatively quickly, and getting to gentry, which basically, let's switch the song, which frees up a lot of the present population, frees up a lot of power from the nobility. And the last one is freeholding, which means that the nobility no longer has any kind of noble rights to land, which really will lead to the nobility losing power extremely quickly. But that's a long-term array, because for that you need to get rid of the levy system, you have to reform your state, make it less corrupt, and therefore you will be busy for centuries getting there. Now, as the next estate, we are going to look at the burghers, which will be the next episode, so leave a like and subscribe and see you there.